On behalf of the Japanese American Museum of San Jose, both Michael and I would like to extend our appreciation to the Japanese Chamber of Commerce of Northern California for extending us this opportunity to speak a bit about Japanese American immigration to the United States. So what are we going to cover today? We'll cover a little bit about the historical background to the immigration. We'll talk about immigration to Hawaii, the United States, West Coast, the first ones to do that. Just a little bit on Pearl Harbor, both what happened before and afterwards. We will talk about the major point of this presentation will be about the internment, the imprisonment of West Coast Japanese. We'll also touch on the military service of Japanese Americans during World War II, the 4 important U.S. Supreme Court cases that dealt with the internment, and then we'll cover a bit about the apologies made by our government and the compensation offered for the internment. And then lastly, we will ask you to help us keep Japanese American history alive. So a little bit on the historical background. From the 1600s to the 1700s, in the United States, there was a common form of labor, which was called indentured servitude, or contract laborers. This meant that for someone who wanted to immigrate to the United States, ship passage was very expensive. They could contract with a company or an individual to pay for their ship passage in exchange for them working for 5, 6, maybe 7 years. For manual laborers, this meant they worked in conditions that were near slavery. They had very little in the way of rights. In 1790, Congress passed the Naturalization Act. This act said that only free white people can become U.S. citizens through naturalization. This meant that people from Asia could never become U.S. citizens. In 1865, the 13th Constitutional Amendment not only abolished slavery, but it also abolished indentured servitude since it was very similar to slavery. In 1882, because of the large number of Chinese immigrants that had come to the United States, the Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited any further immigration of Chinese to the United States. And in 1900, Hawaii became a territory of the United States. Prior to 1900, Hawaii had been an independent country, had been the monarchy of Hawaii, and that meant that immigration was different to go to Hawaii and the United States. It also meant that in 1900, the U.S. Constitution and U.S. federal laws applied in Hawaii. So why do the Japanese seek to immigrate? They went not just to the United States, they went to a number of other countries. It was economically motivated. There were some difficult economic times in Japan, especially after the Meiji period. People left seeking better lives. Most of these were young men who thought they could go to other countries, earn their fortunes, and come back to Japan, as rich men. Mainly came from these 4 prefectures in southern Japan. Now, the very earliest immigrants, though, both to Hawaii and the West Coast of the United States, they were really not representative of the later immigrants. And so I'll talk about those early immigrants here in the next few slides. First, I'm going to talk about Hawaii. They were the first. In 1868, June of that year, there was a group called the Ganen Mono. That's the first year, the Meiji period, who arrived in Hawaii. Almost all men, just 6 women. They came to work on the sugarcane plantations, which had been well established in Hawaii by that time. This group is widely celebrated by Japanese Americans in Hawaii for their contributions to establishing the Japanese American community. Indeed, in 2018, there was a large celebration of their 150th anniversary. But then, between 1869 and 1885, the Japanese government prohibited any more immigration from Japan to Hawaii. The Japanese government was concerned about the very poor treatment that Japanese immigrants got, and were also concerned about not projecting an image where Japanese immigrants were simply manual laborers. But it picked up again in 1885, and in February of that year, 153 new arrivals came. They were contract laborers. They were under this indentured servitude contract. So for the time period from 1885, when indentured servitude is allowed, to 1900, when Hawaii is annexed by the United States, so indentured servitude is no longer allowed. These sugarcane and plantation owners recruited many contract laborers from Hawaii. A number of these were unsophisticated young men, men who had never seen a single stalk of sugarcane. They came thinking they were going to earn their riches. Instead, they found that plantation life was brutal. There were long days of exhausting labor. They lived in dilapidated company housing, and they were paid a little, but what little they were paid, they were forced to spend in company stores. There were even European immigrants to Hawaii who were hired as overseers who could physically punish these Japanese young immigrant men for talking or smoking or resting during their long, difficult days of labor. They could actually be whipped. Because of these very poor conditions, many of them returned to Japan, and some even managed to flee to the West Coast. Just 4 pictures of what life was like. In the upper left picture, you'll see these immigrant workers having just freshly picked pineapple. You will notice how those pineapple plants, they have these sharp, very spiky leaves. On the picture at the top right, you'll see a railroad engine. These sugarcane plantations were so large that the companies built railroads throughout the sugarcane plantations to move the sugarcane to market. In the lower left corner, you'll see 2 women. Women also worked in sugarcane plantations. You may notice they're dressed in this very heavy, fully covering their bodies, this clothing. And you might wonder, why would they dress that way in this warm, hot, humid climate of Hawaii? It was to protect them from the sugarcane leaves. If you've never seen a sugarcane leaf, they are very slender and they are very sharp, and they will readily cut you if you don't have good clothing. And in the lower right picture, you'll see a group of both men and women who are these sugarcane plantation workers. Continuing on. So, again, in 1900, Hawaii became a territory of the United States. That meant some very important things. One was that indentured servitude contracts were null and void. Because of the Constitution, people could not be held under indentured servitude contracts. Going from Hawaii to the West Coast was no longer considered immigration from a foreign country. You were free to go. Many Japanese Hawaii went to the West Coast under this policy. So many, in fact, that President Executive Order stopped that practice. Yes, executive orders existed back then as well, and one was put in place to prevent Japanese from freely moving from Hawaii to the West Coast. Another consequence was the Chinese Exclusion Act applied. That meant no more Chinese could immigrate to Hawaii, which put even more pressure on the sugarcane and pineapple plantation owners to seek immigrants from Japan. One good thing that happened in 1900, in about the middle of 1900, is birthright citizenship became available to children born in Hawaii. That meant for the Issei, when they had children who were born after May the 1st, they were U.S. citizens by birthright. All of this continued, and it culminated in 1920, when 43% of the population of Hawaii were Japanese Americans. By 1942, soon after Pearl Harbor, 38% of the population were Japanese. Now I'm going to switch locations, and I'm going to talk a bit about the West Coast of the United States. So the first known settlement of Japanese Americans on the West Coast was a group that established the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony. Almost all men, just one woman. This was a group that was actually fleeing the political unrest following the Meiji Restoration. They arrived in San Francisco in May of 1869. Less than a month later, they established a tea and mulberry farm colony in Colima, California. That's where that blue star is in the map of California. They intended to raise tea and silkworms for sale. But unfortunately, they weren't very good business people, and the colony only lasted 2 years. The sole woman, Okei Ito, she died only 2 years later at the age of 19. Her burial took place at the colony, and her burial site is still there. That site, the Tea and Mulberry Farm Colony, is kept up in good condition by a nonprofit organization. It is held to be the Japanese Plymouth Rock for the West Coast of the United States. Plymouth Rock being a location on the eastern seaboard of the United States as the starting point for the Northern European immigration to the United States. They also celebrate the arrival of that Wakamatsu tea and silk farm colony. And indeed, in June of just last year, they had a large 150th anniversary. So now we're going to talk a bit about the west coast of Hawaii, the west coast of California, excuse me. There were three primary arrival areas for Japanese Americans on the West Coast: Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle. They came not as contract laborers. They were not indentured servants. That was unconstitutional. So different from Hawaii. That meant they got to keep their earnings. They didn't have to give their earnings to the people who paid their ship passage. They started businesses. They used that income to start small businesses. Those who were farmers, who were very experienced and good farmers, they may have started as farm laborers, but they were really motivated to lease and own their own farms, which they did. Immigration to the West Coast was also not affected by the ban on immigration to Hawaii. So from 1868, immigration from Japan to the West Coast continued unabated. Larger numbers of Japanese started coming after 1882, when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And then after 1900, a lot of Japanese Americans left Hawaii because they could and went to the West Coast of the United States. All of these Japanese Americans, particularly in the West Coast, meant they formed a lot of Japantowns, community areas where there were Japanese businesses and shops and community centers. There were over 40 of these Japantowns established in the United States. One was even established as far east as Massachusetts, which is on the east coast of the United States, though nearly all of them were actually concentrated in the west coast of the United States. And if you'd like to learn more about those Japantowns, I refer you to this book at the bottom of the slide, The Japantowns of Yesteryear by S. Floyd Morey. Continuing with California. So, California was where most Japanese Americans went. That unfortunately led to a big anti-Japanese movement in California. It was given the name Yellow Peril. There was a fear the Japanese Americans in California would take over businesses, agriculture would come to dominate California. This fear resulted in 1908 of a gentleman's agreement between the governments of Japan and California. First, it halted the immigration of manual laborers from Japan. No more Japanese labor migration. However, it did allow that the brides of Japanese who were already in the U.S., that those brides could come. So some of the Japanese men in the United States returned to Japan to get married, and then they could go back to the U.S. Others who were too poor to afford the ship fare to go back to Japan, they had their pictures taken, sometimes next to nice cars or nice homes that they didn't own, and write a letter about themselves and mail it back to their families. And the families would try to arrange a marriage between a young woman in Japan and their son in the United States. They were known as picture brides. If you look at the picture on the lower right, You will see a number of these picture brides. They have just disembarked from a ship and they're waiting to get through customs to meet their husbands physically for the first time in their lives. This all continued to happen. California passed the California Alien Land Law in 1913, which said aliens ineligible for citizenship. That meant immigrants from Asia. That truly meant immigrants from Japan. This affected the Issei generation. They were now prohibited from buying land in California. Several other states in the Western United States followed suit. It continued even after 1913. If you look at the note on the red square in the upper right corner, you will notice this article about a senator, a U.S. Senator Phelan of California, who proposed a constitutional amendment to deny birthright citizenship to Japanese born on American soil. Fortunately, that never passed. Now, there was an effort made to try to get citizenship for Japanese immigrants. In the Supreme Court in 1922, a gentleman, Takao Ozawa, filed a suit. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, upheld that the Japanese were ineligible for naturalization. Then in 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 was passed, which barred all immigration from Asia. But even with all immigration having been stopped from Asia, that did not stop the efforts for prejudice against Japanese Americans. One of those was shown in 1927. There was a Supreme Court case, Farrington versus Tokushiki. Japanese communities had for numbers of years built schools, sometimes using their sparse resources to be able to build schools, to be able to teach their children Japanese. And there were public communities that sought to close down those schools. This time, 1927, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Japanese Americans and ruled they had the right to keep those schools open. So now we're in 1940, on the verge of Pearl Harbor. There are 120,000 Japanese Americans in the Western United States and 158,000 in Hawaii. Pearl Harbor happens. Now, I'm not going to speak very much about Pearl Harbor because it's been covered very well, extensively in books and publications and scholarly writings and movies. Rather, I'm going to focus more on what led up to Pearl Harbor and the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So even before Pearl Harbor, well before Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt was worried that war would come with Germany, Italy, and Japan. So he ordered the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, to create lists of people that he believed would be potentially dangerous enemy aliens. So the FBI started to do that. So they collected lists of German, Italian, and Japanese individuals. Now, they were supposed to collect lists of only those that they had some evidence that they would commit sabotage or espionage. But instead, the lists were formed with people who were successful, people who were influential in those communities. The FBI used paid informants, so they collected people's names from the rumors and hearsay from those paid informants. Even just having an innocent job, like if you taught judo or sumo, you could be viewed as being militaristic. If you taught Japanese, you must be an agent of the Japanese government. Even if your job was fishing in the ocean, that made you suspect because you had a boat that could meet with Japanese military seacraft. And more importantly, you had shortwave radios so you could communicate with them. All this effort to collect the information was helped by the Alien Registration Act of 1940, unfortunately named the Smith Act, which said that all non-citizens in the U.S. 14 years or older had to register with the government. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, literally minutes after Pearl Harbor, the FBI started going to the homes and arresting these potentially dangerous enemy aliens. At the top of their list were Buddhist ministers. Buddhism was considered to be a dangerous enemy alien religion, and all Buddhist ministers were held to be agents of the Japanese government. And if you'd like to learn more about how Buddhist agents, Buddhist ministers were treated, I refer you to this book here called American Sutra, a recent book. It is also a good history of the internment, so I recommend it to you to both learn about how Buddhists were treated, but also a good summary of the whole internment experience. Community leaders were obviously arrested as well were successful business owners. There were about 2,000 of these potentially dangerous enemy aliens who were then arrested, held in Hawaii for a while, and then removed from Hawaii to be sent to camps on the mainland. And I would like to say at this time, one of my wife's grandfathers, he since passed away. He was a very active, influential member of the local Buddhist community in Honolulu. He was an influential member of the business community in Honolulu. And he was also the owner of a successful construction business in Honolulu. He met all three criteria. He was among the very first, picked up and arrested as a PDA. So these are a few pictures from Hawaii. The first one I'll show you on the top left is a location. It's called Sand Island. And so this is a little island in Honolulu Harbor. This is where those PDEAs were first held. No buildings, no structures had been constructed to hold these individuals. So they put up these very hastily erected tents. This was where people lived day and night, rain or shine, windy or not. These were the kind of locations where my wife's grandfather was held. These next two pictures, which look similar, the one on the bottom and the one on the right, show an internment camp that was built at a location in Hawaii called Honouliuli, or known to the residents as Jigo Kudani, Hell's Valley. Today, it's a national monument, and if you'd like to learn about the effects of the internment in Hawaii, I refer you to the Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii. They have a lot of information related to the internment which took place in Hawaii. Now I'm going to move on to a map. The map shows a lot of stuff, I'm sorry, but I'll try to get through this for you. The first, I've circled all the stars with red circles. Orange circles. They're all circled with orange circles. And that's because these were the locations where those potentially dangerous enemy aliens were first held, both the ones from the mainland and the ones who were brought over from Hawaii. And I've put a red circle around the one in Santa Fe, New Mexico, because this is a picture of that site. This was the very first place that my wife's grandfather was sent from Hawaii to serve his time. Meanwhile, on the west coast of the United States, there was a big fear developing. And the fear was there was going to be a Japanese military invasion of the West Coast. And the Japanese community would support an invasion through espionage and sabotage. First order that came out was a curfew was placed on Japanese Americans. They had to be home by 8 p.m., can't leave till 6 the next morning, and you can't travel any more than 25 miles except for work. The pressure continued, though, to remove the Japanese to inland locations where they could not support an invasion. That became known as the internment of Japanese Americans. Some people use the word incarceration or imprisonment. I believe all three words are accurate and all three words can be used. I use internment because that appears to be the most commonly used term for the imprisonment of Japanese Americans. And if you'd like to learn more about the internment, there are two sites I will direct you to. The first is the National Park Service. They have a Japanese confinement sites program, and this is their website. The other is an organization called Densho, which is in Seattle, and they are dedicated to the online collection and preservation of Japanese American internment histories and stories. The pressure culminated in February 1942. President Roosevelt signed an executive order which set up an exclusion zone on the West Coast. And this exclusion zone was set up because, number one, the West Coast military commander believed Japanese Americans could not be trusted. It was also because only 2% of the people living in the zone were Japanese Americans. And so these notices, like you'll see here on the right, started going up. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. And the word ancestry was deliberately used, so it included not just the Issei from Japan, but included their US-born, US citizen, children and grandchildren. And the notice said people could only take what they could hand carry. So they had to decide what to do with their furniture, their appliances, their homes, their businesses, their motor vehicles, their farms. Most ended up selling for pennies on the dollar. Hawaii, though, was not an exclusion zone, and that's because nearly 40% of the population were Japanese. Hawaii was an important military base for the United States. Many Japanese Americans worked in defense industries. So you couldn't simply send away nearly half the population of a state and expect it not to collapse. Perhaps most importantly, the Hawaii military commander believed that Japanese Americans were loyal. Just a few pictures, people who have had to sell out, despite this one man saying he's an American. This whole removal was called an evacuation, but evacuation is done for the safety of the people involved. That was not the case here. I want to emphasize that Japanese Americans went with dignity. This is a very common way that families went, dressed in their best clothing. They went with their personal dignity intact. You may notice that there are tags on their luggage and their outer clothing. Each family was given a set of identically numbered tags, and that was how the family and their possessions were then identified. People would sew large duffel bags, take really big trunks, trying to make room for as much as they can take, even though they ended up having to sell or lose nearly everything. There were still a number of older single men. Here's a group of them getting ready to be taken away in this truck. Now, here's the map again. This time, I'm going to highlight just 3. If you look at the map, you'll see these black circles, small black circles. I've put red rectangles around 3 of them, since I'll show you pictures of those 3. These were known as assembly centers. The fear of the Japanese Americans on the West Coast was so great, the government didn't wait for the actual internment camps to be built. They first sent them to these temporary locations called assembly centers. This is a picture of one in Salinas. If you look at the right picture in the lower right corner, you can see their possessions were just dumped out on the ground for them to forage through and try to find what they owned. This is a picture of the Santa Anita Horse Racetrack Assembly Center. This horse track still exists today. It's still in Los Angeles, but there was one in San Francisco, or near San Francisco, called Tanforan, which is today the Tanforan Shopping Center. Well, there wasn't enough room at Tanforan for all of the arrivals, so late arriving people could not be put in barracks. They were instead shown horse stalls and told, your job is to clean these out, and these are going to be your homes for the next several months. Now, eventually, the internment camps were built, and then people were moved from the assembly centers to the internment camps. It's a picture of some of them getting ready to ride a train to their next home. You may notice all the armed soldiers because these people are so dangerous. So this is the map. Last time I'll use it. The orange ovals surround each one of the internment camps. They're officially known as relocation centers. I put a red one around Heart Mountain, which is in Wyoming, in the center of the photograph, because we have a picture of that at our museum, because most of the Japanese Americans from the Santa Clara Valley area of San Jose ended up at Heart Mountain. Now, we are very lucky here in San Jose. If it ever gets down to 0 degrees Celsius, we think it's really cold. Can you imagine moving from here to Heart Mountain? That first winter, it is minus 32 degrees Celsius. Just some more pictures of arrivals at these internment camps. Please make no mistake. These were prison camps. They had a barbed wire fence all the way around. They had guard towers manned by armed soldiers. This is a picture of probably the most famous camp called Manzanar in California. No paved roads. When the winds blew, the dusty conditions were terrible. When it rained or the snow and ice melted, it was really muddy. This is a very typical picture of an internment camp block. People lived in these long barracks buildings that you see on the front of the picture. For the inset picture, you can see what a barrack layout looked like. One thing you might notice, there's no toilets, no kitchens, no showers in the barracks themselves. Those were in the 2 larger buildings in this group of barracks. The dining or mess hall, teams of internees cooked food and served it, cafeteria style. The 2 other buildings in the center, one was for women, one was for men. They had communal showers and toilets. This is a reproduction of a living quarters that we feature at our museum. I certainly hope when the pandemic's over, most, maybe all of you will come visit and see what it was like living inside one of these actual barracks rooms. Just a few pictures here of life in internment camp. Eating in a common mess hall. There were schools in camp, though they're poorly furnished. Some teachers were recruited from the outside. Internees who had been teachers were just called teaching assistants in camp. This is what passed for a classroom in one of these schools. There were hospitals in camp. They're very primitive. But by law, nobody is to be paid more than a private in the Army. Consequently, if you were an internee, MD, and you worked in the camp hospital, you were paid the equivalent today of roughly $500 a month, and everybody else was paid less. This was a dental clinic in camp. The government quickly sponsored large farms outside the camps. They didn't want to keep paying for the food. Japanese farmers were very skillful. They were able to grow a wide number of crops, including Japanese vegetables, which for the first time meant the Japanese internees could get Japanese foods in their diet. They also raised pigs and chickens, even a few places raised cattle. But raising crops, raising plants wasn't just for eating. It was also for helping to beautify your life here at internment camps. This is a photograph of a library. I like to point out this was taken late in the war because there were actually Japanese books. Early on, Japanese publications were prohibited. Even speaking Japanese was not allowed. There were a number of unusual things in camp that I found interesting. One was newspapers were published. They were all subject to censorship, but it was still a way for internees to keep tabs on what life was going on in the outside world. These are two pictures of artwork that were taken in our museum. Artwork was also a very big pastime. Baseball, of course, was another big pastime. Baseball was very popular, both in Japan and in the internment camps. There were a number of young men who served in the military service of the United States, despite the existence of the internment camps. The first group originated in Hawaii because so few Japanese Americans in Hawaii had been sent to internment camp. There was a large group of young Japanese American men who applied political pressure to serve. They were sent to the mainland for training and evaluations of their loyalty. They did so well, the Army decided to form a larger unit, which was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This team did so well in combat, fighting in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. They became, for a unit of its size and length of service, the most highly decorated for bravery in U.S. military history. There was a second group that didn't get quite the recognition it deserved. This was a group that was comprised of Japanese American Niseis who could speak, read, and write Japanese. So they were recruited in the military to fight in the Pacific Theater, where they were interpreters, translators, and interrogators. Many, ironically, were actually Kibei, children who had been sent back to Japan to learn the language or to meet their families. There were 4 U.S. Supreme Court decisions important to the internment. The first 2, Gordon Hirabashi and Minoru Yasui, held that curfew order was constitutional. It was constitutional to put a curfew on a race of people because our country is at war with their country. In 1944, in the Korematsu case, the Supreme Court ruled that Executive Order 9066 was constitutional. It's constitutional to remove a race of people from a geographic area because they might be a military security threat. But that same day, actually, in the Mitsui Endo case, the Supreme Court ruled that while the government had authority to remove people from an area, they did not have authority to put them in prison. And from that day forward, internees were free to leave camp. Here's a picture of a number of them leaving camp. They're given a train ride home and the equivalent of $300 today, but no armed guards. When they came back to the West Coast, they faced prejudice, hatred. These are just a few pictures indicative of the treatment that they faced when they got back. Many years later, under 3 presidents, Carter, Reagan, and Bush, an effort was made to look into the injustice of the internment. And in 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which was then led to the older President George Bush signing a letter of apology and authorizing the payment of compensation for the injustice of the internment. So this is a copy of the apology letter that President George Bush signed. I do want to take a few minutes to talk about how it wasn't just Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, interned. Canada had their own independent internment program, and they interned about 25,000 Japanese Canadians. About 2,000 Japanese Peruvians were sent to the US for internment. And besides the Japanese, there were about 10,000 German Americans and 3,000 Italian Americans who were also interned during the war. So let me take just a couple extra minutes, I'm a little bit over my time, and talk about what happened after World War II. There was a big contrast between the West Coast and Hawaii. On the West Coast, since people, nearly all of them, lost everything, their possessions, their businesses, their farms, they had to start all over again, start from scratch. So consequently, there are only 3 Japantowns in the West Coast that survive today. In Hawaii, those small business owners, those Japanese American business owners, got to keep their businesses. Those businesses got to be regionally large. At the end of 1945, the War Brides Act was passed, which allowed brides both from Europe and Japan to enter the United States. That's how my mother got to be in the United States. And in 1952, finally, Congress passed an act that made it eligible for Iseis to become naturalized U.S. citizens. And between 1952 and 1965, 40,000 were. And then finally, 1965, a new immigration law was passed, which for the first time again allowed immigration from Asia. This was the beginning of the Shin Issei generation. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you learned a little bit. If I got anything wrong, I would like to hear from you. I'd like to make the presentation accurate. I'd like to remind you that our mission at the Japanese American Museum of San Jose is to collect, preserve, and share Japanese American history, culture, and arts. Please visit our website. You can learn more about our history and our mission. You can become a member online or a volunteer. We definitely would like to have online volunteers to help us with virtual programming. You can donate to our mission. You can donate artifacts, which we may or may not exhibit, but if we don't exhibit them, then they become items we can sell in our raffles. And you can always buy something neat in our stores that helps support us too. So thank you,